Now, what happens if we want to map different types of parameters? I have created here a base called all parameters. It's a dummy base with all the possible custom parameters that you can create in TouchDesigner, as you can see here. So I am going to map this to my preset manager by drag and dropping. I will leave this as custom parameters and fetch all of them. So I'm going to leave that as default. And now I'm going to make a couple presets. So let's make a first state for this. And let's make a second preset by changing some of these things. I'm going to change a couple references, move some of these values around so that you can see what happens when I trigger the preset. Let's say this is thing 2, toggle on, and some of these values perhaps do whatever just to test. I'm going to store that in a second preset. And now I want you to see what happens when I trigger the preset. Pay attention to especially the objects operators. So I'm going to set preset 0. It's going to write the right data, although in a different form. So as you can see, it changed from a reference to an operator inside of this to its absolute path. That is a requirement for Preset Manager for two main reasons. One of them I will explain here, and the next one in the following video. One of the main reasons is that this is more efficient to store inside the Preset Manager because it's a string. So the Preset Manager grabs a reference to an object and stores it as a string, not as an object directly. So that reduces the size of data that the Preset Manager must hold. And the other reason why this is converted to an absolute path is because the Preset Manager can help you to find things if you move your objects around. But we will cover that in the next video. Okay, now pay attention what happens if I set this to preset 0 or preset 1. As you can see, things jump around. And the things that are interpolatable will behave differently than the things that are non-interpolatable when instead of jumping, I set to morph. So let's see what happens if I do morphing here. Notice these values and compare them to number which are floating points. So as you can see, the floating point values interpolate, while the things that cannot interpolate, which clearly are things like text or a toggle or things in a menu, then they simply snap to the value that are set on those presets. Perfect. So clearly there is a distinction between interpolatable and non-interpolatable values. So it will behave according to what the parameter can do. So keep that in mind when you use this tool. Now what happens if I want to have more than one component mapped to my preset manager? So that is no problem. So I'm going to bring this other operator called Lisa Curves that we were playing with before. I'm going to expose the editor, and I'm simply going to map this new operator here. Now I have two operators associated with my preset manager, and I also want to fetch everything, so all these parameters from this second operator. Now let's create a preset. I'm going to store the current state. That will be on preset 2. I'm going to move some things around. Maybe that's enough, and then I'm going to store that in preset 4. So now I want you to pay attention to something. Remember that preset 1 and 2, so preset 0 and 1, that because we're counting from 0, they store information for this object, because when we store that preset, this one didn't exist in this preset manager. And from preset 2 and 3, both of them exist in the preset manager. That is, however, not an issue, because if I trigger preset 0, only things that were present at creating preset 0 will trigger. Preset 1, the same thing. We see this one is not affected. And if I press preset 3, for example, or preset 2, then this will go back to the state. So preset manager can distinguish between things that existed on creation or things that were added later. If you want to have a complete set of parameters for your presets, you obviously need to override your preset if you want, for example, to go to preset 0. And then if you want to include this in that preset, the data needs to be written again. So I'm going to override preset 0. And now preset 0 contains information for both of these nodes. So that is for bookkeeping, and if you want to actually change something of these parameters on preset 0. Okay, I hope that makes sense, and that shows you that you can have theoretically no limit on the amount of nodes that you can map to the preset manager, and also no limit on what types of parameters you can map. The only distinction is, of course, like I mentioned, the interpolatable parameters, which are floating points, and the non-interpolatable ones, which is everything else, like a menu, a string, a toggle, and so on. All right, in the next video, I'm going to show you how we can deal with moving things around in our network. Perhaps one last thing I should say is that there's only 3 types of parameters that are not supported in the preset manager. Those are header, because header is just this static text which doesn't do anything for us, sequence, which is a similar situation, and this Python type parameter, which is an expression that cannot be evaluated inside preset manager. Everything else is valid. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy my work and want to support future projects and access to all my tools, please consider subscribing on Patreon. It really helps keep creation and research going. You can also connect with me through my website, Instagram, or just drop me an email. I would love to hear from you. All links are in the description below. See you next time.